the recording now. Something is happening here. We might lose power anytime. What I want to look at today with you is on quantitative research. You may notice that data analytics research is more of quantitative than qualitative this type of research. And we need to focus, therefore, more on quantitative studies than qualitative research, although you are not forced not to do a study that is qualitative. But we assume as data analytics, people will be looking at data that is already existing and then using different analytic tools to get meaning out of that. So I just want us to go through the quantitative research initially, and then we move on. It did not pick my slides. Sorry. Let me share my screen. Okay. It was thinking. We need to revisit what you have done under your other modules, especially when you look at quantitative methods. Things like the word test, we need to test something. Things like validity. Are you measuring what you think you are measuring? Issues of reliability. If I were to repeat the same experiment, would I get the same results? Issues of generalizability. Can I generalize your findings to other situations? Then we need to identify some advantages and disadvantages associated with quantitative data and expose you to an understanding of basic statistics and an acquaintance with some common statistical tests. We may not be able to do that part today, but that's the aim of us looking at quantitative research. Quantitative data, as you know, is about quantities, and therefore we deal with numbers. We tend to deal with numbers. We hope we should be able to explain phenomena. An occurrence is a phenomenon that requires an explanation. So we do explain phenomena by collecting numerical data that are analyzed using mathematically based methods, in particular statistics. And in data analytics, we have got data analytics models that we use to analyze data. And we hope you will be able to utilize those techniques which you learn in other modules. And quantitative research is again systematic like any other research, which is scientific. And it's an investigation of data and their relationships. So when you do research in data analytics, you may find that you are dealing more with numbers or with quantitative data than with qualitative data. The kind of research that involves the tallying, manipulation, or systematic aggregation of quantities of data. To take a while again. Now, the objective of quantitative research is to develop and employ mathematical models. We are hoping that in data analytics, you are learning a lot about mathematical models, and you are coming across these models, which we hope you are going to be able to apply to research when you conduct your dissertations. We are going to be able to develop and employ mathematical theories and testing hypotheses pertaining to natural phenomena. So what we are looking at is more of measuring or measurement as a key in quantitative research, because it shows the relationship between data and what is observed. So whatever we decide to do, we need to think about quantitative research. Nasi. Muchirundinzwa?
Yes,
Yes, Prof.
All aspects of the study are carefully designed before data is collected. When you do a quantitative research, you need to carefully design something before you collect data. That means you have to go through a certain process. And this data, which is in form of numbers and statistics, often is arranged in tables or in charts or in figures or other non-textual forms. You will find that when you do quantification of data that is non-numerical, like qualitative data, you will find that you can present it like in a word cloud, in trees, things like that. That means we are using figures to represent or to quantify non-numerical data. A project can be used to generalize concepts more widely, or predict future results, or investigate causal relationships. You find, therefore, that in quantitative research, your aim is either to predict, to investigate causal relationships, or to establish correlations, which is something that other researchers may find challenging. But I know when you do your data analytics, you should be able to use your knowledge from other modules and apply them to research methods. Quantitative data is building blocks on its own. There are certain things, there are certain words that we come across that we use in quantitative research that you need to revisit. I want you to go and read more about these words or about these building blocks, like variables, a variable. Something that you need to think about as a variable, something that you need to talk about as a variable, something that takes on different values or categories, being a variable. Last slide. We need to talk about words like operationalization. You know, when you say customer loyalty, when you say someone was studying patient retention on people who are on art program, how do you retain them once they've started the program? How do you measure retention? How do you measure it? Motivation. How do you measure motivation? An attitude, a perception. How do we measure that? So we also want you to go and look at levels and scales of measurement. Last time, I'm not sure whether it was your group or what, or the entrepreneurship group. We talked about nominal data, interval data. We talked about ratio data, things like that. You need to talk about those scales of measurement because each type of a measurement has its own way of being analyzed. If you analyze wrongly, then you are using statistics or you are violating some of the laws of statistics. So you need to know how to measure and how to analyze different scales or different measurements. So if it is categorical data, if it is continuous data, you need to talk about how that data is manipulated, how that data is analyzed. We have dichotomous and continuous, dichotomous. Then you also need to think about psychometrics, issues of reliability and validity. As I said, reliability is about replicability. Can you repeat that same experiment and obtain the same result? Can we apply your model to situations and obtain similar results? Validity, are you measuring what you are supposed to measure? Is the construct that you are measuring being measured using the correct instruments? So read around that. Question, Ivak, are we together?
Yes, yes, Prof. I'm sorry.
Okay. Let's talk about measurement errors. Random errors and systematic errors. Go and revise those things. We will not talk about measurement errors here in our module, but these are some of the issues that you need to remember and to use when you work with the quantitative data. Just for recap, I'm going to share my screen with you. Can you see my screen? Okay.
Yes.
When you look at research, think about variables in terms of there's someone that is not muted. A dependent variable and an independent variable. An independent variable have a presumed effect on another variable. They are known as predictor variables or manipulated variables, although they may not be manipulated like time. But it's dependent variable. It is that variable that is presumed to affect another variable. A dependent variable is that which varies with a change in the independent variable. So if you change a condition, something happens, the outcome variable, that is the dependent variable. And in research, we always want you to be able to identify the dependent variable and the independent variable. An arrow moves from the dependent variable to an independent variable, from an independent variable to a dependent variable. Then think about categorical variables, with several attributes. And we often talk about test variables when you work with quantitative data. We also talk about dichotomous variables with just two attributes like male, female, gender, male is male, female. Then think about mediating variables. You have got an independent variable that influences a dependent variable. The growth of a child, the weight of a child, for example, as a dependent variable is affected by what? Let's say gender is the growth of a child. Does gender become an independent variable?
Food intake.
Or food intake. But food intake as an independent variable, which is going to affect the weight of a child, may be affected the salary or the status of that income, that person. There's something that also mediates in between. That is a mediating variable. If it is intervening, it is something that also affects the dependent variable by being affected by the independent variable. Again, go through your modules and see if you can get examples of this. Then we also have an antecedent variable, as we have been talking about, a variable which will affect both the dependent and the independent variable. We have talked about operationalization. Data. When you present your discussion, you know, when you say I've got a hypothesis, I have a hunch, and I'm assuming that this thing is going to happen this way. This variable is going to affect that variable in that way. You are actually talking about concepts and concepts, but these are things that you cannot really or may sometimes really measure directly, like an attitude, like a motivation, like customer loyalty or brand loyalty. It's very difficult to conceptualize them. You often find people I'm going to measure, I want to find out the effectiveness of a certain program or a certain intervention. How do you measure effectiveness as a construct? You have to operationalize. What we mean by you have to operationalize. When you operationalize, you are turning that construct into measures, because we want to understand how you measure that concept. Then we want to see precise procedures or operations that has to be followed to measure that construct. So it is a perception. Then how do we quantify a perception? How do we quantify an attitude? How do we quantify internet usage? How do we quantify competency? These are constructs. And if you are talking about competence of something, this one is competent, more competent than that one. How do you measure competency? How do you measure internet usage? To operationalize those words. That's the only way you can proceed and move on to test that hypothesis. If we can conceptualize it in terms of numbers, in terms of quantifications, then we have the very most important thing for us in research, the hypothesis. A supposition or proposed explanation of an observed phenomenon with limited evidence, often provided as a starting point for further investigation. We look at a hypothesis as an assertion or a hunch about two or more variables are related or associated with each other. No, so in a box, I looked for various authors and references who define a hypothesis. In other words, you are going to read and find that each text you read will give you a different definition of a hypothesis, a tentative answer or explanation to a scientific question, a proposed explanation of a phenomena, a statement that can be tested by scientific research, a shrewd guess, hunch, inference formulated and provisionally adopted to explain observed effects or conditions or to guide further research. And this is based on existing theories and knowledge. You know, hypotheses are important for us in data analytics because most of the times in research, we will be testing them. So hypotheses are powerful tools for scientific inquiry. They stimulate critical thinking process. If you as researchers, as they anticipate outcomes of a research, because once you have got a prediction, you assume that something will happen. That motivates you to do something, and that gives you the critical mind, which we look for in data analytics. They provide direction and objectivity to the research activity by stating a presumed relationship between variables. They are therefore bases for frameworks for drawing conclusions of a research inquiry as they act as bridges between theory and reality. This is the basis on which you develop your models. They show how change in one variable will be associated with change in another variable. And based on the way they are stated, the hypothesis can suggest that the most appropriate research. That means a path that you are going to follow is dictated by hypothesis. Because if you say I am the objective, my objective is to determine the relationship between variable X and the variable Y, and you are hypothesizing that there is no relationship between in our studies. If you say variable X causes variable Y, then already I am into causality relations. That I'm already being told how to proceed with data collection and how I'm going to analyze that data. If I say demographic data is likely to influence internet usage, already I am seeing regression analysis or ANOVA, because already I am trying to look at which demographic characteristics will influence a person to use internet. So already my hypothesis is determining to me the direction in which I must collect data, how to collect that data, and how to analyze that data. So we expect you to be able to formulate good hypotheses. And a good hypothesis should show conceptual clarity. It must be stated in declarative statement form. In the present tense, there is no relationship between X and Y. If X does that, then Y happens in this way, in the present tense. It must be clear in terms, meanings and implications which cannot be doubted. It must be very straightforward. And therefore, it must have conceptual clarity. That's why we operationalize. They must be based on scientific theory. Hypotheses don't just come up. You read theories, you read other researches, you read other people's work, and then you formulate your own. And therefore, they give you the requirements for a testable hypothesis. They must be very specific. That means you must include the variables that must be manipulated or measured, and identify the populations to be examined. Indicate the proposed outcome of that study. It must be possible to reproduce the results of a hypothesis. And therefore, it has to have a systematic relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. Hypotheses, therefore, must have empirical reference. That means we must have ultimate numerical reference. We must have empirical basis from an area of inquiry. You, as a researcher, be sure that the methods that you are going to use are to take your proposed hypothesis. You know, someone would tell you that I will do chi-square. I will do a regression analysis. I will do a machine learning modeling. We want to see how that modeling is going to suit the outcome of that hypothesis. Be very clear about it. Objectivity, it must be specific, not general. It must explain expected relationship between variables. We say it is a declarative statement that identifies the predicted relationship between two or more variables. Therefore, there must be consistency. There must be consistency between the body of theories, research findings, and other hypotheses within the study that you are doing and within the existing body of knowledge. So whenever you test a hypothesis, we expect it to be compared with other situations. Usually, we should formulate a hypothesis in simple, understandable terms. And in research, we advise our students to give direction if it is possible. A positive, statistically positive, significant relationship negative, significant relationship. We need to know the direction in which your hypothesis is going to fall. Unless, of course, you are simply talking about X because X and Y are related, something like that, and you are not interested in direction. But usually, we expect you to give us the assumptions that you are talking about. When you state a hypothesis, we normally expect to use certain what do you call it, notations in stating those hypotheses, and often make sure that you are very clear about the kind of hypothesis that you are dealing with. So read around associate variable hypothesis versus causal hypothesis, or simple versus complex hypothesis, directional versus non-directional hypothesis. I will not be asking you about these things, but I want you to be clear when you do your researches that the hypotheses come in various types. Directional, non-directional, which is what I'm going to be interested in my module. And most importantly, the alternate hypothesis, which is going to be my most important way of you expressing hypothesis, which we normally want to see in our research pieces of work. So when we deal with the hypothesis, always remember that I often find the students failing because I hardly ask a question in analytics which does not expect the students to get a null hypothesis and an alternate hypothesis. Always try to, by all means, to make sure that you write your hypothesis in a way that H sub naught means not. There is no relationship. There is equality. H1 is the alternate hypothesis. We don't use HA, we use H1. When you have multiple hypotheses, that's when you say H11, H10, H12. But you find that it is very cumbersome in research, especially in data analytics and business itself. Because sometimes you are required to test more than 6 or 4 hypotheses. Therefore, simply state the alternate hypothesis as H1, H2, H3, H4, and so on. But remember, once you do that, always remember that what is tested a hypothesis is the null hypothesis. The statistical tests do not test an alternate hypothesis. So always make sure that you interpret your hypothesis correctly.
Sorry, Prof.
Otherwise, yes?
Okay, there are people in the lobby. May you kindly admit?
Okay. Many of them. So when you test a hypothesis, the statement that you give is what is being tested is the null hypothesis. So this is what for I module. How would you create a hypothesis in business research or in data analytics? This is what you often come across, because what you come across as data analytics is that you get onto, say, a database, you get this whole big data set, and now you want to manipulate this data, and therefore you must come up with it. So what you need to do, therefore, as we said in the last 2 lectures, is to come up with a research problem, derive your research objectives from that problem, or set out to convert your objectives into research questions as required by your department. Then look at the objectives. Some would be looking for causality, some would be looking for associations, some would be looking at whatever. That therefore help you to write testable research hypotheses. So each time you want to develop a hypothesis, think about the research question that you intend to answer. And that's why we did the problem statement and the objectives. So start by looking and studying the research question. Then review that research question because it has to be smart. Usually, we want it to be measurable. Then review literature. This is what we have intended to find out. But now, how do I find it out? How do I phrase this hypothesis? You read around that aspect in our articles where this hypothesis might, or this area might have been studied, so that you learn how they formulated those hypotheses, get to understand the construct that we are dealing with in that setup, and develop a conceptual framework. Because that helps you to identify variables and how they are related to another. Then write your initial answer to that research question, which is the prediction. So your next step is to refine that step, that is the hunch which you have written. And each hypothesis should be written in such a way that it identifies the operationalized variables, then identifies the specific groups or entities under study. It must contain only relevant variables. You know, when you say there is a significant relationship between gender, income, status, and you list all those things, it becomes cumbersome and it becomes, irritating. We must understand that all these are actually constructs that are supposed to be talking about a certain concept. So if I say demographic variables are influencing what, then I'm talking about something that is straightforward. So you decide how you phrase that hypothesis. Phrase that hypothesis in such a way that it predicts an outcome of an experiment or an analysis. It's very evident. That is very clear. And this can be done in 3 ways, which when I was reading around, I came across 3 ways. You can use an if-then statement. For example, the first segment of a hypothesis states the independent variable. Then the second part contains the dependent variable. So when I study Newton's third law of motion, you say you remember it says there is an equal and opposite reaction. What Newton is actually implying is that if one takes an action, some form of an effect or an outcome is expected. So the action that the research changes varies, commonly referred to as the assumed cause, is the independent variable. Now, this independent variable, which is the action, then enacts the dependent variable. So if children spend more time listening to radio lessons, then their exam scores will improve. That's one way of stating a hypothesis. You can also correlate method, where we say academic research is phrased in terms of correlation or effects. Actually, this is what we normally use. State the prediction between the variables. So the level of confidence spend on studying has a positive effect on their examination scores. Or teachers who have competencies to use ICT in their professional practice will deliver quality education and ultimately be able to effectively guide the development of students' IT competencies. That's a correlational hypothesis. Or sometimes we can state it in terms of a different expectations. Like we write a hypothesis in a way that clearly spells out the prediction about the differences between the groups or variables under study. You know, when you work with ANOVA, McNova, type of analysis, you are actually looking at different expectations because they are working within the groups. So if I say the differences between the groups and the differences within the groups, when I'm dealing with, and I'm actually talking about method 3. So a simple hypothesis is not necessarily a simple statement, ladies and gentlemen. A hypothesis should provide a clear introduction to the experiment or activity and its intentions, possible outcomes. Always think about a hypothesis when you do conduct a study. I will share this chapter. This is a chapter that I'm developing for students so that we understand the concepts. I will share this chapter as soon as I complete it with you. I'll stop sharing. Allow. I'm allowing April. I'll make another. We still have time. Oh yeah. We're going to make it also with this wheat. Okay, we need to be very clear now about the research designs. As I said, if you formulate your hypothesis, then we need to be directed in terms of which design you must take, you must adopt. And that will also guide the research instruments. I will not deal a lot about the research instruments, but I will talk about the research designs in more detail. In business research, in data analytics or business studies or entrepreneurship, we tend to talk about the 3 basic research, the philosophies. As I said, the philosophy is the study of fundamental nature of knowledge, reality and existence. It's a theory that guides as a guiding principle of behavior. And we want to understand how people do certain things. You know, when we talk about the Internet of Things, you want to understand what it means. You want to understand what is happening. We want to understand how situations are explained. So we have got positivists who posit that reality is a concrete empirical reality that exists out there, and that the reality is not influenced by the perceptions of those who observe it. That's how I explain positivism. Positivists believe that society shapes individuals and rely on scientific quantitative methods. In other words, when you do your machine learning modeling, when you do Internet of Things and you are explaining things, when you are doing regression analysis and whatever you will be dealing with, those you are actually using positivism. You are deducing meaning out of. You are using deductive reasoning. Interpretivists are the opposite of positivists. These assess, they say access to reality is only through social constructions, such as language, consciousness, shared meaning, and instruments. Prefer humanistic qualitative methods. These interpretivists really believe individuals shape society. You know, the fact that you believe that you are the head of the household is stuck in a Zimbabwean man. Because where is it written that you are the head of the household? In the Bible? Or in your mind? So much that you cannot even imagine any less than your wife. That's interpretivism. Because your reality is in your mind. And because you are a Zimbabwean, you are in a patriarchal society, you believe you are the head of the house. And therefore you are the one who has to go to fend for the family, and you spend your time thinking about where to get money to look after women's children. Who said they are your children? You know, it's in your mind. And that's interpretivism. Reality is in the mind of a person. And so we interpret reality. We interpret Lobola we equate Lobola to being the owner of the children. So that's how we interpret our reality in Zimbabwe. The exact opposite will happen in Malawi, where it's matriarchal society. The woman is the head. So the woman, the children belong to the woman. Go to Botswana, it's the woman who goes to the pub. The man stays home looking after the children. That's a construct. That's interpretivism. But positivists will tell you this is what it is. Concrete up there. Then we have the third philosophy, which is mixed. The mixed methods, the pragmatic philosophy or pragmatism, believe that yes, you can believe that the world is measurable and is concrete, but there is no way you are going to remove the value-laden aspects of your reality. So it believes that both interpretivism and positivism can operate at the same time. So while I can measure something, I can also deduce meaning out of it. While I can measure the construct perception of people towards a certain thing, I can tell you that people will accept a technology when they perceive its usefulness, when they perceive its easiness to use, when they perceive that some other values or other external variables are in favor of what they want. Yes, but how do I explain that perception? So I get into their values, into their cultures, into their what? So the normative aspects will come in, because I would like a gadget when I've seen somebody who I look at as a model is holding that. I like this bag because I saw that bag being used by a woman that I look at as a model. That I'm now interpreting that meaning. So mixed methods will help us to explain and interpret the meaning of the concrete or the values that we will have obtained. And this is when we have to ask those people questions to explain their observations. So you find that positivism are found in natural sciences. And this is where you fall as data analytics mostly, because we deal with objectivity, we deal with control of manipulation of variables, we deal with the generalizations, we predict, we look for causalities, we quantify, and we deal with the large scale of data. And therefore, positivism has a lot to do with quantitative research. Interpretivism, quantitative research, has positive methods of data collection. And this is where we do tests, we do surveys, we do experiments. And when you are looking under your surveys, that's when you are dealing with your quantitative data. You manipulate that data and you look at it. Interpretivists, on the other side, assert that there is no general rule about human behavior. It assumes that behavior is only understood in the context in which it occurs. So if you give teachers less money, they won't teach. That is not always true. Teacher teacher kana ukamunyima mari anoticha mwana wake because ari professional. Apa anotrainwa papa anotrainwa to be a professional. And so the two do not tally, even if you make a hypothesis of that. Go and find out. That follows naturalistic paradigm, belief that multiple realities exist, and therefore that is guided by interpretivism. There are multiple realities in a person. People interpret meaning differently. And the emphasis here is on subjectivity, on motive, on feelings, on opinions, on attitudes, on reasons, on obligations, on individual differences. So we therefore look at interpretivism as symbolic, as holistic, ethnographic, inductive, as responsive. In other words, we are looking at soft data as opposed to hard data which we find in under positivism. This uses social or cultural science to interpret human behavior. And it is associated with participant observation because we need informers. We use methods to analyze this kind of data by identifying factors that motivate people to behave in certain ways, for example. And therefore, our methodologies include unstructured methods. Because I can do an unstructured interview, I can do an unstructured observation. I do use an unstructured instrument because all I'm looking for is a meaning from those people. Whereas positivists will have to structure because they want quantification. They structure because their questions must be the same. The person who is responding to the question must respond it in the way me, the researcher, want you to respond. Because if I leave it open-ended and I'm asking in English, our interpretations of the questions will be very different. So in order to make sure that everyone understands it the way I want it understood, I give the person a structured questionnaire so that he simply says or she simply says strongly agree, or disagree. Often, very often, or not, I give them the answers and I force them to tick where I expect them to tick. So the only thing they have to do is that they have to tick where they agree with me or where they agree according to the question that I will have asked. Now, interpretivists have also their own methods. Their naturalistic methods like ethnography, or narrative documents, they do interviews, they do observations. In other words, they do a lot of thick descriptions. And that's why when they collect data, usually they record it, then they transcribe it, and then they have to subject it to en vivo, and then do a lot of analysis. The other philosophy, which we normally don't talk about, but it does exist, and which can be used by data analytics is realism. Realists retain positivist orientation, but they recognize the subjective nature of research. They argue that it's inevitable that values are embedded in every research. You cannot ignore values. They maintain an ontological stance that an objective reality does exist. They differ epistemologically with positivists by adopting an orientation that human beings cannot be totally objective. So the nature of knowledge that they talk about is that you can never be objective. Therefore, knowledge of reality is distorted by the human subjective nature. Honestly, kubasa kwako shua kune opening. Ndobva waita very objective chaizvo kupa mwana wakwaningi kumuraini. Basa iroro. Iwewe muzukuru wako achitsvaga basa. You know, when they talk, they're actually saying there are certain realities which will bind a human being. So this statement implies that social reality exists in the objective world. This implies that while positivists hope to predict human behavior, realists simply seek to generalize explanations. Therefore, they largely employ qualitative methods, but they quantify their qualitative findings. This, however, suffers an uniformity, as competing theories are likely to be generated if different researchers hold different values. Because if this study, a study X is being done by a realist, a quantitative person would tend to say, let's quantify this thing and interpret it. And these are the people who mistakenly normally develop hypotheses in qualitative research. Pragmatists are purely people who are in between. Realists are closer to positivists. Pragmatists are in the middle. They accept both methods, and these pragmatists use mixed methods of research. They do surveys, they do interviews, they do observations, they can do experiments, and they can do action research. They can do virtual worlds, they do historical or documentaries, or they also do meta-analysis. They can do case studies, and they use numbers and measurements. Because that's mixing the methods. It has an advantage because one disadvantage of quantitative is countered by the advantages of qualitative. And so these studies are usually very strong, but very few people manage to employ them or to use them properly. It's either you become more qualitative or you become more quantitative, but when you say mixed methods, be very clear about what you are saying. If you decide to use mixed methods, then we need to know, are you more quantitative than qualitative? Are you more qualitative than quantitative? Or are you both qualitative and quantitative? This is where even the process, the data collection and the interpretation and the presentation must depict what you will have chosen. A paradigm is a model. In the data analytics, you use models. It's a way of thinking. It's an intellectual perception or a world view derived from a philosophy with respect to truth. So when I say I am in this paradigm, I'm talking about, are you quantitative or qualitative? If you are quantitative, then you are in the deductive mode. Knowledge is the objective thing which can be measured. Quantitative, as I said, the problem is structured and variables are defined. In quantitative, equate social phenomena to natural sciences. The study is focused by research hypothesis. That means we test hypothesis. The qualitative paradigm, on the other hand, is inductive, most cases, and it's interpretive. Knowledge is subjective. The problem is unstructured. Usually you go out without understanding the problem. You believe that the phenomena are difficult or impossible to quantify mathematically, such as beliefs, meanings, attributes, or symbols. So we tend to produce theories in qualitative paradigms, and our aim is to gather in-depth understanding of human behavior and reasons that govern such behavior. So our studies in qualitative paradigms are focused by research questions, and we investigate the whys and the hows of a decision making, not just the what, the where, the when, which is quantitative. You can go on to look at quantitative research as objective and qualitative research as constructionistic, and the quantitative therefore is reliable but not valid. Qualitative research is valid but not reliable. I want you to explain why that is happening. Read around it and why we say one is valid, one is reliable. So you go on and read about the differences. So qualitative research is good if you want to adopt it. because it enables us to look at complex situations so that we can understand the person's experiences. And we have fewer restrictions or assumptions which we place on data to be collected. Because not everything can be quantified, that's true. And individuals can be studied in more depth. It's good for exploratory research, which is if we want to do quantitative research. And it is good for hypothesis generation. If you do some qualitative exploratory study, then you can actually get a few hunches, you get an idea. The participants are able to provide data in their own words and in their own ways, which we don't do with quantitative data because we force them. But then, qualitative research is more difficult to determine the validity and the reliability of linguistic data. You know, data that we collect in different languages and in our language especially, translating it into English and translating it into another language, it distorts a lot of meaning. So there is more subjectivity involved in analyzing that data. And data overload often occurs when you are collecting qualitative data because they are using open-ended questions. And that can sometimes create lots of data which cannot or which take long to analyze. Qualitative research is time-consuming in terms of analysis, actually. Encoding, what is it? You transcribe and then you deal with it and then you create whatever. It's problematic. But when you are doing a strong research, when you are dealing with when we do research methods, we often say it is good to triangulate because each paradigm has advantages and disadvantages. So triangulation is a combination of the two paradigms. We cross-check the validity, which we take from the qualitative, and we also take reliability from the quantitative, and therefore our studies become complementary and therefore to become valid and reliable. Now, once your philosophical orientation is clear, that I am positivistic, I am naturalistic, I'm whatever, you need therefore to decide on the roadmap, on your blueprint, on the way you want to do your investigation. While research is a systematic and investigative inquiry into a problem, which leads to one, to create new knowledge. It's about problem solving, bedeviling society. Design is to create a plan, to craft something, to design, to produce a scheme, to make a forward plan, to guide, to make a master plan, which is a blueprint. So we need to know, once you have decided your orientation, then you decide on your research design. What is the roadmap? How are you going to do your data? And there are several types of these research designs, which I would like you to read around on them. You can do a historical. Data analytics can do a historical study because you just go into the database and you are looking for what happened between 2012 and 2020. You just look at it. That's historical data. That can be historical study. You can do experiments. Experimental research designs. And remember, experimental research designs are in two. When you do a study where it's purely experiment, it's purely naturalistic, it's purely natural science, you are in the lab, you can control variable X, measure variable Y in controlled settings. That's a pure experiment. But there are also experiments where you cannot control all the variables. Like when you do experiments with humans and animals. You cannot control human behavior totally because you cannot put them in the lab. You can only ask them to go and do X and Y and not do B and Z. But You cannot make a follow-up to make sure that they have not done B and Z. You can only rely on what they would have told you that we did. You know, think of a situation where you are trying to study the influence or the effectiveness of NAM, a certain powdered milk versus breast milk. Then you take a group of women, the group A, you say, go and only feed your child with NAM. Group B, only feed your children with your breast milk. Then you do your pre-test, pre-measurements. Then after some time, you bring them back, and then you measure again to see which children are growing better now on formula or on mother's milk. Are you telling me that all these women were religiously following your instructions? Mwana ndokuchema zveshua kwakurega ubika porridge. Or a mother-in-law comes and I tell my mother-in-law I happen to belong to the Ndao group, and then my mother-in-law comes and I am breastfeeding, and my culture tells me that if a mother-in-law comes, I must breastfeed my child. Cultural. Then you tell me that I will not do that. When I go back to have the post-test, I will not say it. That is why it is called quasi-experiment. It's not a pure experiment, it's a quasi-experiment. It's an experiment, but with other variables that were not controlled. Then we can also use designs like surveys. A survey can be exploratory, it can be descriptive, it can be explanatory, it can be analytic. We have case study research designs. All these designs are found in literature, and we can use them to get answers to our research questions. I've already talked about these things that I'm reading. Ethnography is an investigation of culture through an in-depth study of the members of that culture. It involves a systematic collection, description, and analysis of data for development of theories of cultural behavior. It studies people, ethnic groups, ethnic formations, their ethnogenesis, their composition, their resettlement, their social welfare characteristics, their material and spiritual cultures. So data collection is often done through participant observation, interviews of unstructured questionnaires. Its purpose is to understand what is happening naturally in the setting and to interpret the data gathered to see what implications could be forced from that data. That's an ethnographic study. When we talk about grounded theory, we are looking at a research approach that is designed to discover what problems exist in a given social environment and how persons involved handle them. So this involves the formulation, the testing, the reformulation of propositions until a theory is developed. Research method that operates almost in a reverse fashion from traditional research, and at first it may appear to be in contradiction to scientific methods. No, grounded theory starts with the identification of anchors that allow key points of data to be gathered. Then we look at concepts, what is coming out, a collection of codes of similar content that allow that data to be grouped. Then we form categories, we broad groups of similar concepts that are used to generate a theory. Then we do the theory explanations that explain the subject if the research of that research. which we normally call a hypothesis. You know, phenomenology is an inductive descriptive research that is developed from phenomenological philosophy that aims to describe the experience as it is actually lived by the person. So it's concerned with the study of experience from the perspective of the individual, bracketing taken for granted, assumptions and usual ways of perceiving. Now, this is usually based as a paradigm of personal knowledge and subjectivity, and it emphasizes the importance of personal perspective and interpretation. It is a very powerful tool designed for understanding subjective experience because it gives us insights into people's motivations and actions, cutting through a clutter of take for granted assumptions and conventional wisdom. A phenomena. We need to understand this phenomena. Kana tichiti varoi vanoexista, tirikutichi, kana tichiti mheni inogadzirwa, tirikutaura kuti those phenomena must be explained. And when you explain them, you do phenomenological studies. Case study designs are most common in data analytics because they tend to focus their studies on cases. And case study designs include the designs we have already talked about. Case study research is initiated to solve an immediate problem, to improve quality on an organization or understand the practices of that organization. And this, you find that this is normally what data analysts will always say. Now, what I want you to do when you get this, what is it called? PowerPoint presentation. You are going to learn a lot more about data collection techniques. I will not repeat these techniques because these are the things that are done undergraduate, at undergraduate level. They are just there to help you remember how you can also collect data. Research instruments for quantitative paradigms are structured questionnaires, structured interview guides, structured observation or schedules or checklists. And when you are collecting data, we say triangulate your data. This is when you are collecting data from individuals or entities. That is, if you are not collecting data based on secondary data. And for qualitative paradigms, we say semi-structured or unstructured, semi-structured or open interview guide or observation guides. And again, we triangulate. So when you write your dissertations, if you choose qualitative paradigm, we expect to see semi-structured or unstructured. If you choose quantitative method, expect structured instruments. You don't say research instruments, then you say questionnaire. What kind of questionnaire? We want to know what kind of questionnaire you are dealing with. So thereafter, you look at questionnaires and how they are designed. I will not bother you with this, but please go through them and read on them, okay? The rest is about questionnaires and how they are drafted. So it's 6:47. I will stop now. Unless there's a question. Questions, clarifications? Oh, all right. I'm going to stop this presentation now. Please go through the slides.
Ma'am?
Yes?
I have a question. Psychometrics, you spoke about reliability and validity. So reliability being about applicability, and then I really didn't understand validity.
Reliability is about, okay, let's take a situation where you have got a, my analog watch, muchiri kumaziva kana analog scale ekunyama ekutengesa nyama analog anana 0 1 2 3 4 chichi aneka point aya
one chitombo chekumuva chacho
handiti ukatarisa point aya inofanira kutanga pana 0 chap handiti, but it's not always the case newear and tear.
Yes.
Inogona kutanga pa 0,1 kana kuti inogona pakutanga pa before 1, pa before 0 pacho.
Okay.
And each time ukaenda unotenga nyama wachisa pa scale yakadaro inotangira ipapo.
Yes.
And that scale is very, very reliable. And it haichinji. Inotangira ipapo. And kana ari muwache munhu arikudza kuti iwe wachi yangu iri reliable, it's always 5 minutes behind.
Okay. Asiri kumbira vamwe.
Asi inenge isiri valid because iri kumeasure chi.
So reliability yekuti airege kutangira pari wrong ipapo.
Inoramba ichidzokerera error yayo iyoyo, kana error iripo error. Kana ichidzokerera inodzokerera futi ipapo. Its repeatability iri ipapo. Saka when an instrument is reliable, ndikakupa question iya iwewe nhasi, handiti nema questions angu 10, ndikakupa futi after 2 weeks ma-questions iwewe unondipindurira exactly because uchiri iwewe uri kupindura question yacho.
Okay, all right.
I must make my instrument in such a way that if I ask you today and then ask you after 4 days, you must give me the same answer.
Okay, all right.
Ndokuti reliable. But scale yandiri kutaura kuti uchanesa nyama, handati uchanogadzika nyama paskero ineka pointer. That scale haimisi yekumezha nyama, ndekumezha weight yemwana, handiti? Iskero yekumeasure weight yemwana, not nyama. Weight is most times acceleration due to gravity. mg. Iwewe uisa nyama pamusoro pe-weight machine. Measure. That machine is not valid. Saka kune validity kwete reliability. Validity, are you measuring what you are supposed to measure? Okay. And this is where our construct formation comes in. Because when I measure an attitude, I measure a perception. Do you like this? To what extent would you like this attitude? But do you want to use this again? It means your perception.
Okay.
Your intention, your behavior. Saka unenge uchitsvaga manje kuona kuti this instrument iri kumeasure zvairi kufanira kumeasure, and that's where we say operationalize.
Okay, all right. Thank you, ma'am. And thank you so much.
All right. Zvimwe tozosangana nazvo takuita kumberi, handiti? Panhasi tombomirira pano timboende end meeting.